Hey there, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here at the Borough of Manhattan Community College, and specifically this next exciting webinar, which is going to be around how the Citizen Entrepreneur Explorers program teaches students about creating their methodologies for completing their research. So just a quick review of what CEEP is, and that really is about us making sure that we get students excited about their communities and their neighborhoods by getting them involved in their communities and neighborhoods. One way that we do that with CEEP is we actually get them to go into their neighborhoods, discover entrepreneurship happening nearby them, create a little research project around it. So that was our first webinar, was how do you come up with a good question to ask about entrepreneurship in your neighborhood? In this section, what we're going to talk about is how do we actually make a research method to go and answer that question. And this is what Raymond and I are going to talk to you about today. Welcome to this webinar. Raymond Luo, who is actually a master's student at NYU. Yeah, it's that really cool college right in the middle of New York City. And he's coming to us straight from New York. It's always nice to have folks like you working with our students and making sure that they get a great start in research. Thank you, Raymond.
Hey everyone. Yeah, so one of the key points we were talking about last time was understanding what the knowns and unknowns were for your research question. But one of the really important things is how do we answer things that we don't know about? So the key to answering this is to measure how your one of the key things is measuring how your responses answer your question. Show this slide.
Yeah, exactly. And Raymond, I'll just add to what you're saying there. And that simply is when you're finding an answer to a question, how are you going to find that answer, right?
Yeah, so for example, when you're looking for answers to your question, you have to understand what are you measuring by? What is the measuring stick for your question? If you're looking for height distributions, you're not going to be measuring it in Celsius, you're not going to be measuring it in miles. I mean, that's more of a direct and obvious type of answer. But what if we were trying to measure something like happiness? Are you measuring with apples? Are you measuring with dollars? What about business success? You have customer count, revenue, trash thrown out. These are all things you need to consider when you go into the methodologies for your research question. You have to understand, how am I measuring the answers to my question? And how do these measurements help me answer my question? Okay.
And I'll add to that with this. When you put that slide back up, you'll notice that one of the things that we see whenever we're trying to measure something like this is you actually see like all of these different choices. It's not like there's just a couple of things that you can measure with. Just imagine the possibility and to dig into that possibility for, like you mentioned here, for what is business success? Like, what exactly does that mean to have business success? There can be all kinds of things. Maybe someone thinks that the largest number of customers is the most amount of money, or what kind of impact you're having in the neighborhood, or maybe it's a bigger state impact that you want to have with your particular business. So we can decide all those things as we put together our metrics.
Yeah, and then aside from just deciding our metrics, one of the things we need to consider is, are we looking for quantitative metrics like miles and feet, or are we looking at qualitative metrics? For example, how do we measure happiness? So that's one of the things what we need to consider is when you're designing your methodologies, there's actually a lot of different decisions you need to be making. Every decision you make for your metric has a variety of different decisions you need to make to how do you measure the metric? What type of questions am I asking? Am I looking towards making a survey, which I could be passed out to a lot of people to get a lot of really fast responses back, to get like a larger number of data? Or am I trying to sit down and have one-on-one talks with business owners for half an hour to 15 minutes? So decisions you make for the methodologies really shape how your research forms and how your research question is getting answered.
Yeah, and I'll add there too. One of the other things that you saw on that signpost was the idea of observations. So if you decide to go and, let's say, observe how an entrepreneur manages a business of a certain type, if you're going to do observation, then you have to literally observe every tiny little piece of what's going on. The act of your methodology needs to collect a solid amount of information, or what's called data, anytime that you're going to pull together a methodology. That means that you need to think specifically about how you can get a large enough volume of information that it matters. If you're doing an interview, then your whole transcript of your whole interview matters. Every single word that was said matters, because you can now analyze that really easily. And I also wanted to go ahead, Jessica Pitts is joining us right now. And it's exciting to have two of the research mentors for the Citizen Entrepreneur Explorers program in the house. She's coming to us from her own PhD work that she just started, which is exciting for her. So it's nice to have this global group of people who are helping the students who are dealing with working on their entrepreneur research projects. Welcome, Jessica. Thanks so much for joining us today. She's remote in the situation here, so she'll unmute herself as soon as she can. And as she unmutes, we'll have her add to some of the things that we're also offering to the students in the various different places that we have for the material that we're covering today. But Raymond, I'll have you pick back up right where you left off.
Yeah, so when we were talking about the different questions that we could be asking and how they formulate the answers for our research project as a whole, one of the things that often comes up is, how do I measure something qualitatively, right? For example, we mentioned back then is a key question is, if we want to measure happiness, how can we measure that? A lot of times it's really hard to decide on what our measuring stick is for more qualitative and emotional things. So we need a type of quantitative scale for our qualitative question. And then I'll answer that a very typical way of measuring this is we use something called the Likert scale. So the Likert scale, what it does is provides a range of answers for the surveyees to answer. And it normally goes from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, where each of the multiple choices represents a spectrum of different answers about how they would feel. So what this gives us is a way of quantitatively measuring something that's rather qualitative and otherwise very hard to capture. On the other hand, it also allows us to compare different surveyees results. Just because one person says they're happy might not mean the same thing as another person's I'm happy as well. So we need to give them a wide range of results, a wide range of answers to compare the results to give us a better understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, and let's dive into there to one of those questions specifically. I want to pull it apart for our listeners and watchers here. When we have one of the questions, there are fewer customers at the boutique when there is a weekend train construction in the area. Please indicate your level of agreement with the previous statement. So what you're actually doing is you're thinking, if an entrepreneur is answering that question, what they're answering is, what are my observations of my customers? How have I observed my customers' behavior changing? And have I observed any changes like that? So these types of questions are actually quite good at picking up what someone might be observing or thinking or feeling about certain things. The question at the bottom is, more customers make more choices on our online website than in store. Please indicate your level of agreement with the previous statement. So these are particular customer behaviors where you say like strongly disagree on one end, all the way to strongly agree on the other. These types of Likert scales can also be placed into scenarios where you're thinking about someone's feelings about something, where you might have a statement such as, I often feel stressful during my workday. And if you're asking that of an entrepreneur, what you're actually kind of feeling out is, how is the person as an entrepreneur feeling about their work and about the experiences of being an entrepreneur? So that's another example of a Likert scale that we could use.
Yeah, and then not just having individual questions, not just looking at how we can design our questions with Likert scales or different type of measuring sticks to look for different answers. The structures of how each individual question plays into one another for your surveys and your interviews is really important as well. And these are decisions that you kind of need to make. There's different ways of structuring your interviews and surveys. Certain interviews go from very specific questions and work very broadly, kind of like a pyramid shape. You can see on the left-hand side of the slide, we have something called like a diamond style, where you start specific, go broad, and then go specific again. And then the last one on the right, we compare it to something called the funnel style, where we start very broad and then we get very specific. The point of having these different type of questionnaire and survey designs is that it kind of creates a level of comfort. You're trying to build rapport with the surveyees you're trying to talk to. When you go up to a person and you're talking to them on the street, of course, you're trying to get answers for your research question. But they're a human being, and then you need a certain level of social interaction to get them comfortable with answering the type of questions you need. And different types of people might give you answers beyond just the questions you're asking. When you're asking a rather open-ended question, if you start at the very beginning of the conversation, it could be very awkward and you might not get very much. But when you go from something specific and you build onto a very general topic, they might have a lot of things to talk about, or they might have a lot of things that they were reminded of to go build on for your research project, so that you would have a lot more insight and a lot of depth towards your answers.
I'll add there too, when you're talking about building that initial rapport, it really is about just being generally friendly with people. Right? So the act of when Raymond and I were first getting started on doing these types of webinars, one of the things that I always do anytime I have meetings with my team is I always say to them, so how are you guys doing? Like, how are you feeling about classes? How are other things going on? And not like diving straight into it. So getting to know the people in your neighborhood and working with the entrepreneurs that might be around you can sometimes mean that you need to like be friends with them first or connect with them as a human being first. That doesn't mean you only work and talk to friends. It actually means that you develop those skills of building initial rapport quickly. Friendliness and smiling and being open and letting them know, like literally, like, look, I'm just a student. I'm just trying to get a research project done here. I really need your help. Is one way to do that, and one way of being honest about the current situation that you're trying to accomplish something in.
Yeah, so like we said, designing the methodologies for your research question actually has a lot of steps. You have to decide on the type of metric that you have to measure your answers with. You have to design how each of your individual questions interact with one another, because you're talking to a person to get your answers back. You have to think about how the structuring the questions could make the person feel, how the questions kind of help on build on each other. So there's a lot of decisions to be made. Of course, at the end of the day, these decisions are kind of made by you. Do I want more quantitative answers? Do I want more qualitative answers? How do I answer my question the best? I mean, we could go on, but at the end of the day,
I would just say before we say thanks for listening to us, and do please stop by and get our downloadable materials. Also remember that when we're talking about research, it's talking about finding information that other people don't know yet. And that can be qualitative, where we're trying to discover feelings and trying to discover behavior and find patterns in behavior, which is what those qualitative type tools like the Likert scale and like interviews and like observations might do for us. On the other side, when we have the quantitative component, is where you're asking like questions about the number of people who do a certain type of thing, or the number of folks who do this type of thing. All of those can kind of add in a little bit more to the variety of what you have. And I've seen some really interesting examples, and I want Raymond to tell us one of his too, but I've seen really interesting examples of students who actually mix both. In other words, they use some Likert scale questions, but they also have conversations and observations that they weave into their descriptions about what they've seen in these different places. So they may deliver a survey, but they also talk about the context of where the survey was delivered and how it was delivered. And I know, Raymond, you've had many different examples of students who've come up with interesting ways of finding a method to measure what they're looking at. I'd love to hear one of those.
Yeah, so kind of to go back on one of the research questions that we talked about last week, it's actually kind of one of the personal favorites, is about the restaurant menus to measure how restaurants have been changing because of COVID. Right off the bat, you can kind of see how the research question already has its own embedded measuring stick. We're looking at menus and how they have changed. So you can take another step deeper and look at, oh, how have the menus changed? Are we looking at the number of items on the menu? Are we looking at the size and the formatting of the menu? Is it virtual? Is it a physical menu you can look at? And then off of that, you can go on to pricing and a lot of things like that. So that's kind of where one of our students, took a very generic question and kind of broke it down very uniquely and creatively to answer this question of how have restaurants performed during COVID in a way that probably a lot of people haven't thought about. Another example is kind of to build on what Professor mentioned on weaving the qualitative and quantitative questions. Is one of the students had a situation where he passed out a considerable number of surveys, like 20, 25 surveys. But beyond that, he also did some interviews on the side to give some context for the questions that he were asking in surveys. Because he noticed that a lot of survey questions, the response is rather abrupt. The questions like, what is your median income? How much what is your sentiment towards your neighborhood, towards your income, and the general rent level in the area. But he went on to go having one-on-one interviews to give some context as to more depth and what is going on. And I feel like that's kind of like what the professor's talking about. You need to combine these individual quantitative questions with more qualitative interviews to kind of add more depth to maximize your research results.
That's so true. Excellent. And thank you guys so much. Plop that slide back up there because we really do want you to come on by citizenpreneurs.com. There's downloadable materials there for you. Jessica Pitts, who's on the call with us now, I don't know if you're able to see her there on YouTube. She may not have come across. She had a couple of technical difficulties getting her audio working today. This is the new world of like online education and giving you information. So these things happen. We just have to keep moving forward. But I wish you guys the best. Raymond, thank you so much for being here today. And thank you, Jessica, for coming in and offering your insights in the chat box and offering some things and ideas about what we might talk about. All right.